Hello. Um, I wanted to make a video about trolls in FPL. This idea that sometimes people say when I buy a player, they blank, and when I sell them, they score. And this often gets associated with certain players in particular, like Zaha. Often people say, when they buy him, loads of people buy him and he blanks for ages. And then as soon as we all sell him, he scores loads of points. And it's really annoying. And I've often had this experience with other players. Everybody's experienced this. As soon as you buy that player, they blank. And as soon as you sell them, they score loads. It's really annoying, right? But I've always assumed that that's just negative bias. Like it's a psychological thing because we just remember the times when that happens because it hits us it sticks with us emotionally. We remember it. Whereas all the times when we bought a player and they scored, or sold a player and they blanked, we don't remember it quite so much. Probably because we just expect it. That's what's supposed to happen. It doesn't surprise us so much, maybe. So I've always assumed that, but I started thinking, I wonder whether there's actually truth to this idea that with certain players, like Zaha in particular, whether there's truth to the idea that just as you sell them, they score, and just as you buy them, they blank. Because I thought, maybe at that very moment when the critical mass of FPL managers all sell a player, because we've all had enough of that player, we've all given up. Well, maybe the player himself has given up on himself, or maybe his manager of his team has given up on him, and he said, "This is your last chance." And maybe we're all feeling the same thing. And so, just as we click the button and sell, there's a trigger that's switched in the player themselves, and they think, "Right, I've got to switch it on now," and they start performing. And so, I was wondering if there might be truth to it. And so I just thought I'd have a little look into it. Basically, I've got all the data of the last 5 years of FPL data, of all the points, all the players, and amongst that data, I've got all their points that they scored each game week. I've also got the transfer balance of each player on each game week, the net transfers out in minus transfers out. Whether this is the net transfer balance. I've also got the total players. It's just rounded to the nearest million in each season. And I wanted to get a sense of when you get a large chunk of all the total managers selling a player or buying a player, when you get a big chunk of them, do they get it right more often than they get it wrong? Does that result in more points or less points? So I've just kind of gone through the whole thing, and whenever my maths isn't great, but so this metric here is whenever more than 2% of all the total managers in a game either buy a player or sell a player, this in the whole game of the last 5 years, this is the total points that are scored. And so basically, this is when it's over 1%, and this is just over 0%, which is, you can almost ignore this metric because over 0% is just noise. Most of this is 50-50. I think forget that, Mum. But when it's over 2% of all players, managers buying a player, so that's like a big chunk, a big movement on a player, in or out. You usually get it right. So when they're selling a player, when everybody sells a play, they ended up with 2,351 points. And when they bought a player, they ended up on 7,022. So the swing is 25% to 75%. And if you think of it as if it was 50-50, it would be it'd be totally unpredictable because whether you buy or sell, it's a 50-50 thing, whether they're going to get more points or less points. But generally, there is a bit of predictability about it. It's 75% of the time you get it right, 25% you get it wrong. I don't know whether that's statistically, mathematically correct, but I'm hoping you're getting a sense here of if it was 50-50, it would be nothing but 25% above 50, so 75%. You generally, that's the predictability score. It's leaning that way. You're getting it right that often. And so I've done that, and I've done it with just loads and loads of players. Looked at all their individual players, looked at 10 million plus players, 8 million plus players, and then loads of individual players, and stuck it all in a table. And this is how it comes out. The individual scores. So this is the column you want to look at. Overall, it's about 75%. If that's the predictability score, 75% plus 10 million. You've got about 70%, 70% for plus eights, all the way down. And I put it in this table here. If you imagine that this is the 50% line here, these are all the. Generally, everything is above the 50% line, which is that they're generally quite predictable. But there's one player, interestingly, Zaha, who's actually below the 50% line there. This is that's the 50% line. He's below the 50% line, which basically means when you buy Zaha, if you're thinking about buying Zaha, you'd be better off not buying him and selling him. And if you're thinking of selling him, you'd be better off buying him. On mass, he is so unpredictable that he does the opposite of what you would think, according to these numbers. Now, the numbers I've got here are not super reliable. They're not a massive data set. Zaha's got 5 years worth of data. These are his total points. Whenever 2% of people have either bought or sold him, we've only got about 100 points worth of data. So it's not a super set. But it's all very 50-50 with him. And it's funny that when 2% of people buy or sell, so that's quite a big swing of total players buying or selling Zaha, they end up getting it wrong. That's very interesting that you get it wrong more often than you get it right. Everybody else is kind of, there's the average round about here somewhere. There's some other lower players. Mitrovic is quite low, which is interesting. I might come back to in a minute. A couple of high players. Gross and Maddison very high. Again, maybe the data is skewed because it's not a big enough data set, but interesting. So Zaha does seem to be a troll, potentially. And this is the graph of this goes back from 2017 all the way to 2022, 5 seasons worth of data. Oh, burping all the time. And the orange line is the percentage of players who have bought or sold Zaha. So people selling him here, loads of people, big sell off there. People starting to buy him, percentage of people buying him, selling, buying, all the way through. And then the blue line is his points each game week. And it's quite interesting to see because as you go through, what normally happens is, so there's a little spike here. Zaha scores some points, and then it's followed by people buying him the next week. But just as they buy him, he blanks. They buy him and then he blanks, and it often happens like that. So Zaha here, he gets another massive spike, and nobody had him at that point, and then everybody buys him the next week and he blanks, and then everybody sells him again. Well, there's just a net. They don't do anything with him, and he scores again the next week. And it often happens. This one they got it right, but here it often runs opposite. Here's another one here where everybody sells him and he scores a few points there. And the really interesting one is this bit here. And in the last 5 years, the biggest sell-off of Zaha happened right around there. I don't know what year that is, but it was a massive sell-off of Zaha. He was injured for a bit, I think. And literally the very next week, when everybody was still selling him off, he gets his biggest points haul of 18 points. It's typical peak Zaha. And if you look at this little period here, he scores big there. Then the next week, everybody buys him and he blanks. Week after that, everybody sells him and he scores again. Week after that, everybody buys him again and he blanks. Then they sell him again and he scores. Then everybody gets annoyed with him. He gets injured and they all sell him and he comes straight back and gets an 18-pointer. And that seems to be typical Zaha. He does the opposite of what everybody is thinking. So with a player like Zaha, you got a few methods of you either just buy him and never sell him, just keep him and ride out the ups and downs, or you never buy him. Or the other thing you could do is just do the opposite of what you think you should do, or do the opposite of what everybody else is doing. So if everybody's selling him, buy him, and if everybody's buying him, sell him. But this is enough to make me think that I might just avoid Zaha. He seems to be quite unpredictable. by comparison, this is Salah's data, and Salah comes out quite predictable. He's reasonably predictable. He's up there. He's right on the average, and it's a bit more predictable. I mean, that one's wrong there, but here everybody sold him and he blanked. He got 0, and they got that one right. So everybody sold him there and there, got that right. It's all kind of, it's not going the opposite. It's going in line with his data. He's actually quite predictable. That one's like exactly in line, which again, I wonder whether the data is a bit dodgy, but seems to be very in line. Here, everybody bought him here. He got some points there. Bit of a peak of buying there. He got points there. Sold him here, and he blanked. That's right. Everybody bought him here, and he got a peak there. Sold him there, and he blanked. So it's all very in line. He seems to be relatively predictable, and he comes out with a pretty average score of predictability, and that's right. Son's pretty predictable, and there's a lot of players like that. So yeah, that's what normally happens. Most players are kind of that kind of average predictability, but there are some players who are harder to predict than others. Zaha is the most unpredictable. Mitrovic seems to be quite a low score. This graph is for people when it's just 1% of managers who have bought or sold a player. Anything over 1%, so it's a little, not quite as big a swing, but a moderate swing. Zaha's still quite low, but Callum Wilson and Mitrovic come out really low. Callum Wilson comes out low on this one, and Mitrovic, again, I'm not super sure about the data, how strong it is, because it's not a massive sample size, but I experienced that with Callum Wilson. I feel like he feels a bit troll-like to me. I've just experienced it recently. And Mitrovic is interesting because at the start of the season, I was surprised that nobody was buying him because I thought he looked like a really good player because he got like 44 goals or something, or 40 plus goals in the Championship last season, and 6.5 million. He looked great. I thought he looked like a great pick, and nobody was buying him. And I think a lot of people had this kind of residue of a memory of when he had trolled them in the past, which I didn't really have because I've only been playing FPL more engaged this season. I was a bit more casual last season, but maybe that's why. Maybe they were right. This is because Mitrovic only has like about 3 seasons worth of data, but yeah, he comes out quite low. So maybe Mitrovic is a bit troll-like as well. I'll come on to Maddison in a minute, but Callum Wilson is interesting as well because there are things you can learn. There's a lesson you can learn here. Because it's not just lessons for individual players like Zaha, but in general, this pattern often happens where you'll see a peak. A player will get a peak, score loads of points, and then it's followed the week or two after by people buying him. But then they're almost always disappointed because he never kind of like repeats it. And here you get a peak, and then people buy him the next week and he blanks. Then they sell him and he gets another peak, and then they buy him the next week and he blanks. And there's this kind of reaction. You can almost see it where people react to the big point score. Another big point score. Everybody buys him the next week and he blanks. Then there's a dip off and he scores again. And here again, you can almost see it. This delayed reaction after the big point score. That's when people buy him. And there's this really funny period here with Callum Wilson of about 10 weeks or so, 10, 12 weeks, where it was literally like everybody bought him and he blanked. Then everybody sold him and he scored. He got a massive haul. Then the next week everybody bought him and he blanked or got a low score. Yeah, I think that's quite a low score. Then they all sold him and he hauled. Then they all bought him again and he blanked. Then they sold him and he scored. And it's just back and forth all the way until eventually he got injured and everybody sold him there. And I feel like there's a lesson there about playing FPL, which is, it seems to most of these graphs are so spiky. When somebody hauls, it's almost, I almost feel like you shouldn't buy them the next week. That because it seems more likely that they're not going to haul the next week. It's not often that a player will get a big haul and then repeat it the very next week. There's a little one there. Look, sometimes you get these little, but most of them are spiky. Now maybe you can get them the week after that or something like that, but I don't know what the lesson is here. Maybe either keep players and ride them out through the ups and downs, or I wonder whether there's a stock market mentality that we can adopt where in the stock market generally when things get at their most bullish, that's usually the time when you should be thinking of selling. And when things get most bearish, that's when you start thinking of buying, because which is counterintuitive. But I'm new to finance and stuff, but that's this vibe I'm starting to pick up, which is that you have to kind of you almost go do the opposite. And I don't know whether that applies exactly to FPL, but sometimes, maybe a little bit, there's a sense of doing the opposite of what you would expect. Yeah, I'm not sure. But that often happens, though. There's a delayed reaction, and it doesn't often seem to pay off. Everybody buys a player after they haul, and then they end up blanking. So, yeah, and then I'll just have a quick look at Maddison. Maddison came out really predictable, the most predictable, and I thought that was interesting because this season, I bought him earlier in the season for the Nottingham Forest game when everybody was buying him, and I thought, looks like a good fixture. Bought him, got me like a 18-pointer or something, and he came through. And he does seem somewhat predictable. Everybody sold him here, and he got, somehow people seem to have predicted his negative points here. It's almost like they sold him just before he got a red card or something like that. I don't know, or a penalty miss. Seems a bit weird, but his overall, the graph doesn't seem to show it that much, but his overall score seems to be quite predictable. Everybody predicted that one there. 2 hauls, and then they all bought him, and he hauled. So he seems to be somewhat predictable. The Man City players, Foden and Mahrez, I thought would be really unpredictable, but they've actually come out with pretty good scores. And Rashford is another person that gets talked of as being a troll. Sterling, most of the time, he's playing for Man City as well. But they're all relatively predictable. Mahrez is actually quite high on the predictability score, which is surprising because of Pep Roulette. But yeah, more often than not, when a mass of players buy Mahrez, they get it right, and he actually does score more points than when they sell him, and he blanks and he gets less points those times. So most of the time, people get it right. Yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say about all of that. So yeah, Zaha is a troll. And if on the very minute chance that it's very, very unlikely that Zaha's going to come across this video, but I don't really think you're a troll. You're a very nice guy. But a troll is just the term given for a player who's very unpredictable in FPL terms, and seems to do the opposite of what we think. So maybe you're just special. But yeah, interesting data. Just trying to figure out if there's anything else I wanted to say about that, but I don't think there is. So I'll stop it there. Okay, bye-bye.